I'm so excited. Chapter 2 of the American Government textbook is my very favorite thing to talk about in the entire world. Not really, but in American government it is. We're going to talk about how our government got structured the way it is and what sort of consequences we see in American government because of what happened so long ago, 200 years ago. So after we declared independence, we said, yay, the world is great. We get our own life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. We're going to get the British people out of our business. This big, massive bureaucracy that was the king's system of government. We're going to be done with it. But unfortunately, when we were done, we're independent, but we had powerful international enemies. We had Great Britain, who was going to come and take over. We had economic concerns about how we were going to finance things. James Madison wanted a republic with like this loose confederation of states that had power to share, but every one of those had failed. And if you look now, even the republic, the European Union, is starting to have real consistent problems about who has power, how do we encourage this massive, anyway, republic. So we ended up having this problem, and we tried to get it worked out. Madison says we need to have a constitutional convention, we need a new form of government, because we had a really weak form of government. Really what happened was we had all agreed that each state would still have its own power. When we declared independence, each of these colonies became essentially a state. So we have these 13 little states, and nobody wanted to have any power shared between them. They all wanted to have their own power, but they had to group up together in order to prevent external forces to come in and take over. So each of these little states was trying to figure out how to deal with money, how to deal with trade between the states. And we created this confederation. The confederation didn't have the power to tax. There was a very, very weak central government. They couldn't really call on other resources to defend each other. And so Madison says, we need to have some changes. Here's some other weird things. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state had one vote. One vote. And they had to all agree on whatever changes were going to take place in this confederal government. These huge states and the small states all had the same vote. And they all had to agree unanimously on any laws that were going to bind them. And they had lots of mistrust between the states. We had slave states, we had freedom states, and the central government was extremely weak. So under the Articles of Confederation, like I said, there was a Congress. Each state had one vote, regardless of the size. Congress couldn't tax. The representatives to the Congress could be recalled by the states. There was no judiciary. There was no legal system really. They had financial and currency issues. It was a big wreck, and there were concerns about slavery. Anyway, there's all sorts of these problems. And one of the things that became a real issue was that in order to be able to vote, you had to be a property owner. And because the states couldn't control their economies very well and they had trade problems, some people in Massachusetts who were farmers were unable to pay some of their bills. There was weak foreclosures and the banks started foreclosing on farms. Now you think, well, this is not a big deal. Well, the states supported the banks because states generally wanted to save property rights and encourage economic growth. But if you foreclose on a farmer, now they're no longer a property holder. Now they can no longer vote. So it seemed like a way to disenfranchise people to assume their property because they couldn't pay on it. So these the elites tried really, really, really hard to quell this rebellion. All these farmers who are going to now become non-citizens or non-voting citizens, and maybe they're still citizens, but still non-voting, lose their farms and their way to sustain themselves. They all rebelled in Shays' Rebellion. And the elites wanted to push down this popular revolt. And they were unable to really deal with it. Massachusetts in itself couldn't end the rebellion. All these people were rebelling against government. And Congress couldn't assist them. They had no army. They couldn't call in other states to help them. So the economic elites hired mercenaries to come and quell the rebellion. And every state started to say, oh my gosh, we are not going to be able to stop some of these radical people who are going to essentially upend our government unless we can call on each other for help. And so Shays' Rebellion ended up stimulating this idea that the confederal system was not going to work. So in 1787, they all get together in Philadelphia. Every state except Rhode Island participates. The meetings are held in private, and they started to figure out that they couldn't really revise the Articles of Confederation. They just had to rewrite it. There were so many things they had to figure out that they just couldn't rework it. Started to meet, they figured out that there were some things they were just going to have to work on. They had to compromise. Ideas that came from the states where Pennsylvania wanted to be more democratic, which is to say give more power to more people. Massachusetts wanted to be more elitist because they wanted to be able to control the economy a little bit better, and they just had a bad experience with some people uprising against them, trying to overthrow their government. Here's some other potential really significant problems. There were big states and there were small states. The slave states in the South had massive population, but do we really want to count slaves as individuals? The problem is, you really can't count them as an individual and then deprive them of liberties. So we had to figure out whether or not we should count slaves, how to count slaves, how to give them power, how to not give them power. And the states in the North mostly said slaves are people, and the people in the South said, well, slaves aren't really people, they're property. So we had to figure out, because each state had the power to control their own property rights, how you could balance the needs of individuals with the needs of the states. So they had to figure out issues of slavery and representation. Representation meaning, should bigger states have bigger power in a federal government, more votes? Virginia plan was the first proposal. They said we should have 3 branches of government. We should have a legislative, which is the most powerful, and they make laws. We should have an executive branch that implements the laws, and then a judicial branch that resolves these disputes. All the representation in the Congress and the legislature would be based on proportion of population in the states. So bigger states would have bigger, more power. The larger states would gain a lot of power. Think about this. We're still under the Articles of Confederation. Every state still gets 1 vote. Rhode Island gets 1 vote. Virginia gets 1 vote. So we're functioning under the Articles of Confederation, and Virginia's like, well, no, we really want to have more power. So all of the smaller states said, that's a horrible idea. And so New Jersey, a small state, said, hey, I've got a general idea. We will strengthen the national government, but we'll keep the Articles of Confederation. We'll still have the small states have the same proportional representation as the large states. In other words, every state gets a certain number of votes, regardless of size. The national government would have some economic powers, would be able to control how the government functions, taxing, and maybe have some military strength. But each state would have equal representation. And they started fighting. Virginia said, no, this is horrible. And New Jersey said, yeah, no, this is a great idea. So we came up with this thing called the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise was a way to sort of combine Virginia's plan with New Jersey's plan. What it did was it created a bicameral legislature. Inside the legislature, we have a lower house of representatives based on population. So larger states got more representation. But we have an upper house, the Senate, based on the states. So every state was equal. So in our bicameral legislature, we have 2 senators for each state, and that retains the rights of the states. That's the small states plan. And the larger states get the lower house, the House of Representatives, based on how many individuals we have in each state. Now the tax powers are given to the lower house. You got to think, a long time ago, the biggest revolts in the fight for independence were dealing with a large bureaucracy from the king and his power to tax. He was taxing stamps and tea and all these other things. So we gave power to more people, representing the people in the lower house. And so tax powers happen in the House of Representatives. So the people who have to pay taxes get to control taxing. And the lower house controls issues, or solves the problem of how we represent individuals. The upper house represents how we give power to the states. So every state's equal in the upper house. In the lower house, it's all of the individuals are equal. This is the Great Compromise. Now, we can look over here at the government plans and we compare them. The Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, and the Great Compromise. And if I were you, I would probably just pause this on the paper, on the video, so you can look at it and take some notes. But it was pretty brilliant to be able to compromise. Nobody got exactly what they wanted. The larger states didn't get what they wanted. The lower states didn't get, or the smaller states didn't get what they wanted. But they both got something that was at least reasonable for both of them. Okay. So, Congress was given most of the new powers under this Constitution. That's to say, they had the powers represented in the people. The lower house representing the people, the upper house representative of the states. Now, in the Constitution, there were some important key features that the legislature had to consider. The legislature was bound on how they could tax and they could borrow. and they were given power to regulate commerce. They could regulate the economy, and they could tax and spend. That was the power of the legislature. They controlled essentially everything in this new Congress. They also were given this thing called the Necessary and Proper Clause, which meant if they needed to set up a government agency in order to enforce the law, that was necessary for that law, and it was proper in order to implement the law. So the Necessary and Proper Clause gave power to the legislature to give them the ability to implement the laws. Now, when we started looking at the executive branch, that would be the president. They were much more limited. They wanted to know whether or not we should have a multiple or... Anyway, we ended up with a president. Now, the president's job is to implement the law, to do the work of the government. The president vetoes laws or says, hey, that's out of line, we shouldn't do that. And then they were the commander-in-chief over the military. Now, here's the problem. There were questions about how do we elect a president. Most of the elites wanted to directly either elect the president from their own body, that would be, say, from the Congress. Because of Shays' Rebellion, they said, we can't entrust individuals to make a good choice for our government. And so it became a very elite process. In other words, we set up a system where each state could decide how they wanted to allocate their votes towards a president. And that's how we got the Electoral College. The Electoral College is a result of this essentially repression of individuals because of what they had seen in Shays' Rebellion, and an empowerment of the elites to make sure that the governing was going to be stable. So in the Electoral College, every state got to choose how they allocated their Electoral College votes, and the Electoral College votes were based on both the state's interests, number of senators, plus the number of representatives from the House, which was based on population. So the combination of population and states' interests allow the Electoral College, determine how many votes each individual state gets in the Electoral College. And for many, many years, the popular vote didn't matter inside the state because there wasn't really a popular vote. It was representatives from the legislature making decisions about who was going to be the president or who the state was going to vote for president. Now, in this new Constitution, they set up a judiciary branch. That judiciary branch is judges. The whole idea behind that branch is that they were going to settle disputes, and they established a Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was going to just make sure that things worked well. Congress established lower courts in order to sort of filter out some of these smaller issues. But then there was this major question about what the role of the judiciary would be. Could they review decisions of Congress? And interestingly, the Constitution is unclear about that, but through some judicial precedents, Marbury versus Madison, for example, they found that they gave themselves power to verify that Congress was acting within their own government, governing power based on the Constitution. So, some other issues. We gave each branch of government separation of powers. That's to say, Congress has some powers, or the legislature. The executive branch has some powers, and the judicial branch has power. And then they have the ability to check each other's powers, make sure that they're not out of line. There were some other things, like every state had the ability to determine who had property rights. And so each state would give full faith and credit to the government actions of the other states. We had to figure out how we would amend the Constitution. And then here are some other big questions. We talked about slavery. Well, how do we count people? Since that mattered in the House of Representatives, slaves were people, but they weren't people. The Northerners wanted to count slaves as people. The Southerners didn't want to count slaves as people, but they wanted to count them as people in terms of population count. So we came up with this really horrible compromise. The North said, essentially, we would like you to stop having slavery. The South said, well, I don't think that's a great idea. The South said, we want to count them as people. And the North said, well, you can't really count them as people because you're not giving them power like people. So we came up with this compromise. It's called the 3/5 Compromise. We essentially agreed to not really talk about dealing with slavery until 1808. They would return, the northern non-slave states would return slaves back to the slave states. And the southern states that had slavery were going to be able to count every third out of 5, another 60% of all their slaves in the population count for representation in the House of Representatives. Now, in 2018, 2019, 2020, whatever year we're in, we say that's a horrible idea to count an individual as 3/5 of a person. But you have to recognize why that came about. If we didn't settle that, we would end up in war. And if we ended up in war, remember this is 1789 or 1787, we would potentially be attacked by other countries. So we make some really difficult compromises in order to prevent even worse things from happening. So in the end, what we get is this constitutional government that sets the standards for how all these other governments interact with each other. And I'm going to leave this up here for you to look at so that you can see, and I'll continue on a second video.